So this morning, let me turn my mic on. For the sermon that I need to deal with soon, because we just finishing up the sermon in the morning, and then as I was leaving, some people asked me a question about the morning sermon. So if you're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, for those who weren't here this morning, it deals a lot with marriage. What should I do if I'm married to, what should widows do? Can widows remarry? What should I do if I'm married to a non-believer? What if I become a Christian? So in the church in Corinth, you can see this happening. Somebody becomes a Christian, but their spouse isn't a Christian. And so the Corinthians have questions about, well, what should I do? Should I stay with them or should I divorce them? And so Paul is answering a lot of the questions that the Corinthians had. So I invite you to listen to the morning sermon as we went through a lot of verses, maybe too quickly. So the question was asked, and mainly verse 12 through 16. So we'll read it, and then I will mention the question that was asked. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, meaning the Lord didn't teach about this. He taught about marriage and divorce, but he didn't teach about the episode that Paul's getting ready to talk about. That if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband. So we're dealing with a Christian, two people married, right? And one becomes a Christian. So the husband becomes a Christian. Should he leave his spouse? And Paul says no. Same way, a woman who has an unbelieving husband. And if he consents to live with her, means he's agreeable to continue in the marriage, she must not send her husband away. And here's the question, comes from verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they're holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Verse 16, how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, that you will, whether or not you're going to save your wife? So what's the big question? What in the world, here's the question. So people can turn in questions back there, but since they asked me at the end of service, I wrote it down. What does it mean that the unbelieving spouse is sanctified by the believing spouse and the kids? I thought only Christians are sanctified. So is that saying they're saved? So that's the question tonight. All right? So let's think this through. First of all, how is anyone saved? Let's talk about that first. First of all, in verse 16, he's saying, by the way, how do you know whether or not you're going to save your spouse? You don't know, right? Now, if an unbeliever is willing to consent to continue living with you as a believer, that's great. You shouldn't divorce them. But if they leave, if they don't want to be in the marriage anymore, you can't make them stay in the marriage. Everybody agree that's what the text is saying? But the question is, what does it mean that an unbelieving spouse is, and I'm not a very good artist. What does it mean? I'm going to draw two houses, okay? Is anybody a good artist? Can you tell that's a house? Okay, that's a house. All right. So we got two houses. Okay? I want you to picture this. I know people who lived in a house where one spouse was a Christian and the other one wasn't. In what way in this household could an unbelieving spouse be consecrated, some translations, consecrated, the word hagios, hagismos, translated either sanctified, holy, or the idea of consecration. So I've mentioned this in many sermons, that in the Old Testament, you could have utensils that are used in the temple, like a shovel, dealing with ashes on the altar in the temple. That shovel was called a what? A holy shovel, meaning it was set apart, it was consecrated for a particular use. And so I explain it that way a lot of times in the New Testament. Christians are called what? Holy ones. We're set apart. Well, the question is, how in the world can an unbelieving spouse be consecrated or sanctified? There doesn't mean that they're saved just because they're married to an unbeliever. So let's think about this. We know that that couldn't be true. Dozens and dozens of verses say you're only saved by what? Belief in the Lord Jesus, believing in His death and resurrection, believing that He's the Son of God. How many verses could we look at tonight if we just said, let's take a moment. I want everybody to go through their scriptures and let's look at all the verses. How many do you think we could come up with in just 10 minutes? A couple dozen? So we're all on the same page. Seems like the New Testament teaches the only way a person is saved, right? Justified, declared not guilty, having eternal life is through believing in Jesus Christ, right? John 3:16 and 24:8. How many verses would we find if we actually did that? That'd be an interesting question. How many verses speak of salvation is through believing? Think we could come up with easily 24, 48, 50? I don't know. So let's just deal with that. First of all, it can't be saying that the person is saved. Because, by the way, verse 16 says, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? But verse 14 says, the unbelieving husband is sanctified. The unbelieving spouse is sanctified, and the kids are sanctified. They're called holy. So I like to look at it this way. If we have two houses, let's say one's a believer, so we'll just put B, and we'll put NB. Okay? And over here, neither one's a believer, NB and NB. So in this scenario, are they being affected? Is there any influence of Christianity in this home? Not by the spouse. There has to be some outside source. But as far as ethics, Christian teaching, right? There's no influence. Now somebody becomes a Christian, and because they're a Christian, it's influencing that household. How? Well, I know people, and you know people, where for different reasons, maybe they were a backslidden Christian, and they married a non-Christian. The Lord gets hold of their life, and they start going to church, and they want to live out the Christian faith, and they have kids, and now that mother or that father, let's just use the mother's a Christian, and is taking the kids to church and at home, reading Bible stories at night when they're young, and teaching their kids as they're growing up in the home. Is that family being affected by this one believer? Are their values about life, about God, consecrating them in that they're starting to think about things from a Christian perspective? I think that's all that Paul is saying. They're being set apart in that the influence of the believer in this home is sanctifying, making a difference, even though they're not yet a Christian. But the influence is there. Now, let's talk about this for a second. Should a non-believer, or should a believer marry a non-believer? So you've been a Christian, you grew up in a Christian home, you're a believer. This scenario that Paul's talking about is a scenario that could happen in the first century and could happen today. You're married, let's say you're witnessing to a colleague at work or a neighbor. And your neighbors, neither one of them are Christians. And one of them becomes a Christian. Ed's talking to his barber. You're talking to your neighbor, Denise. And your neighbor becomes a Christian. But their spouses aren't Christians. What happens? That's what Paul's answering. What should I do? Am I somehow being defiled by being married to a non-believer? What would Paul say? No, it's actually the opposite. Your influence as a Christian is affecting the non-believer's life in a positive way. Now, you don't know whether or not you're going to actually, God could use you to save that person. But that person is being sanctified, even though they're not saved. They're being influenced by the gospel. How many of you know families like this? Right? Some of you have come from that kind of family, where the mother was the only believer and took the kids to church year after year after year after year, and some of the kids became Christians. Right? But we have people in our church, what I would say is, if you're a Christian and you're not married, do not marry a non-Christian. People have gotten upset with me as a pastor because I will not marry a confessing believer to a confessing non-believer. Why? Because their values are different. I had a family get mad at me, 2 families in my ministry overall. I'm not going to say whether it's this church or another church or relatives or whatever, get mad at me because I wouldn't marry the confessing Christian to an atheist. How many say, right off the bat, there's something wrong there? What about missionary dating? How many people missionary date? I just heard another example this morning. So-and-so's dating somebody, and they're not a Christian. They're very worldly. But what? What do people have in mind? I'm going to change them. And what happens? They get married, and it gets rough, and it's like, well, what did you expect? They don't want you to go to church. They don't want you hanging out with other Christians. Your values, they're bothered by. As a matter of fact, some homes, in this case, the non-believer may say, what, are you trying to turn the kids against me? Because the kids, if they come to know the gospel, what do they want their parent to embrace? And so there can be conflict. But what Paul is saying, the believer shouldn't walk out on the marriage and divorce. But what happens if the non-believer says, I don't want to be married to a Christian? What does the Christian do? Can the Christian deny their faith? Can they say, okay, I won't go to church anymore. I won't worship the Lord? No, you can't do that. And so Paul says, if they leave, you can't make them stay. So with this home, there's still the opportunity for Christian witness. Over here, so when I read that the unbelieving spouse is sanctified, I think this way. The ethics, teaching about God has... Now we have to be careful. 1 Peter says, so turn over to 1 Peter chapter 3. This is interesting. 1 Peter 3. Oh, did I turn? I didn't write it down. Where is it, Pam, where there's a unbelieving husband? Okay. Maybe it is, chapter 3, verse 1. The same way you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe the chaste and respectful behavior. That's interesting. Can people be won over, see a difference just in how somebody carries themselves? Isn't that interesting? Now that doesn't mean, what happens if you just preach, even your coworkers or neighbors, what if every time they see you, you're just preaching to them? You're not ever talking to them about anything else or concerned about their well-being in any other area? How many know what's going to happen? That's not all that we talk. Same way within this home. So you can go back to 1 Corinthians 7 for a second. Let's go back to this. Just being around the other person. We're not talking about preaching to the other person all the time, but topics do come up, just like with coworkers. When I worked at a certain place, at coffee breaks and lunchtime, all kinds of topics come up. So the conversation might be about football, what'd you do this weekend? And hey, they know you're a Christian. Hey, what do you think about this? Well, that's an open door, right? It's an open door to discuss. It also opens the door that if let's say your coworker or your spouse asks you to do something immoral, what do you say? What do you do if you're in a workplace and they ask you to do something immoral? What do you say as a Christian? I can't do that. I just can't do that. I'm a Christian, and I'm not going to sin in that area. Same way in the home. Could a Christian rightfully stand up and say, I can't do that? You're asking me to steal, or you're asking me to lie to so-and-so, and I just can't do that. So there's influence there, especially with kids. You notice it says the kids are holy. Now, in this home, the home I grew up in, maybe some of you, when there's no Christian influence, there is no understanding of the Lord's and the Lord and His ways. And so in that sense, but over here, the children are considered also sanctified, consecrated. Why? Because they're getting Christian influence. That's how I read the text. What about you guys? So we're not talking about, when it says, uses the word sanctified, I like the translation consecrated. It can be, if you look it up in a Greek dictionary, hagismos or hagios, you get things like dedicated, separated, set apart. That's what sanctification literally means, set apart, right? They're being set apart in this sense that they're getting Christian teaching. They're getting Christian. They're seeing a Christian in action, and it's having an influence. So, I think what's happening in chapter 7 is they're worried that somehow, by being married to a non-believer, somehow going to corrupt them. And Paul's saying, no, not at all. Actually, it's the opposite. Not that you're corrupting the non-believer. It's that you're having a positive influence in their life. You're actually sanctifying, setting them apart because they're getting Christian teaching, either verbally at times or just by watching. Let me ask you this. Do your coworkers or people that know you well, they watch your life, even so they're seeing how you respond, even maybe if you're not even verbalizing certain things. They're just seeing how you are handling yourself. Levi's calling. I have to put it on silent. I should tell him, hey, Levi, it's Kendall. I'm having a sermon right now. But anyway, that's how I would answer this question. Does that make sense? Any other thoughts tonight on that question? Okay, good question. Did you guys hear? Can non-believers affect? Yeah. Yeah, they can. That's why so right now, if somebody's here and they would be like they'd be a believer, that's why we would say don't marry a non-believer. How many times so-and-so, yeah, they don't go to church anymore. Why? Because their non-believing spouse slowly eroded their convictions. Absolutely. Yeah. That's why Christians should only marry Christians. But if you're in a marriage and you become a Christian, Paul is saying, don't walk out on the marriage. Stay married. If they're wanting to stay married, stay married. Now, if they want to leave, you can't make them stay. So we see that happen as well. But yeah, there's no doubt that this person is going to have a harder time and needs to really pray and stay connected with church, right? And we know somebody here tonight that their parent took kids to church their whole growing up years. Read the Bible story, took them to church all the time. And so there's that influence. But yeah, it can happen to where the non-believer erodes. If you're not praying and if you're not dedicated, what could be the goal of the non-believer? Oh, I'll win them over. Oh, I know I'm marrying a Christian. I'll win them over to my side. That can happen. Yeah, definitely. So I think I'm loving 1 Corinthians. I hope you are too. There's some challenging texts, though, in 1 Corinthians. Is there not? Even in chapter 7. So I may come back this Sunday, haven't decided yet, and deal with some more of those issues. Any other thoughts? Thank you, Denise, for that. Any other thoughts on this topic with the believer and non-believer as it relates to sanctification? Right.
She asked me to be in her wedding, and I didn't do it. I just felt convicted that that wasn't the right thing. Like, it's hard to draw the line, though. Would you go to the wedding?
Right.
Would you, like,
Yeah.
I didn't. I don't know if that was right or
All those are very tricky, right? Talking about what type of weddings, like a believer and non-believer, and that just that you only a lot of times only you know what the right, whether you want to participate or not participate. There's certain ones I would not participate in, right? And this morning when I mentioned at the end of chapter 7, here's one of my convictions with the widow, like in verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, vice versa. Husband is to his wife as long as she lives. But if one of them dies, they are free to marry whomever they wish, as long as what? Right. Freedom to remarry, but only in the Lord. That only in the Lord means what? You marry a Christian. You marry a Christian. So, yeah, you'll have to back me up as a pastor. All right? People get upset. Well, the pastor didn't officiate. Well, that's because there were issues there that I could not in good conscience officiate that. So, all right, that's the end of that first question. I can see why